Imagine being told that after a lifetime of working hard, paying taxes, saving diligently, raising a family, you've somehow become part of Australia's problem, that your success, owning a home, savings in superannuation, or simply living longer is now evidence of intergenerational unfairness. That's the message emerging from the Albanese government's, one of their latest policy buzzwords, the so-called intergenerational lens. This is it really about fairness, or is it finding new ways to tax those who've worked, who've saved and contributed for decades? Hi, I'm Michael Yardney, and welcome to another episode of Demographics Decoded, where leading demographer Simon Kuestenmacher and I unveil the trends shaping our futures. Today, we want to unpack what intergenerational equity actually means, and whether this new policy approach is based on sound data or simply political theatre. Simon, I want to ask you whether older Australians really are getting a better deal, what the numbers actually show, and how policies like this could shape the future of our economy and our housing markets.
Yes, a couple of big topics in such a humble little podcast that we must discuss here. No. So these are really, really big issues. And so we first must remember that every generation, of course, grows up and lives through a very specific, unique set of circumstances. So it matters whether you live in a recession or not, whether you live in economic boom times, what kind of technology is around, how policies shift, whether you have to go to war, and broader demographic trends, whatever. So all of these things are different, and they very much impact how you experience your life. So the direct comparisons are difficult. Yep. So therefore, it is important to park this on one side and then go, what are the actual structural differences that we can measure, that we can talk about? So there is stuff like education levels, higher life expectancy, how many incomes do we have per household, how many households have a parent that is available to do stuff at home, and what do you do in these circumstances? So what do house prices look like? What do wages look like? These are hard things we can measure. So I'd always say stick to that. That makes it a bit easier to measure. But of course, this is also a topic of what do you feel like? It is not so much a hard measurement. People feel very, very peeved if you tell them that the young generation in particular has it harder than you, because you say, dude, I didn't have it easy. I worked hard. I put lots of conscious and hard effort into achieving what I have done. And so nobody, when we talk about this intergenerational equity or whatever you want to call it, says you were just slackers, lazy slackers, which of course kind of is fun to call an old generation slackers, because if you go back to even Roman times, the standard approach always is that old generations call every new generation that enters the workforce slackers.
Yeah.
It is an ongoing trend throughout history. And so it's kind of, historically speaking, hilarious if we flip this on its head. But that's not what we want to do here.
Well, we often talk in these podcasts about population, about economics and things like that. So it seems that today we're going to be covering all that. So if you're caring about Australia's future, whether you're an investor or a business owner, I think our chat today is going to help you. The government's brought up this new concept to me of an intergenerational lens, which make policies fairer. They're looking at making policies fairer for younger Australians. But let's be honest, most people hear and think, here comes another tax on retirees, or that's what me as a baby boomer thinks. We've seen this kind of language before, Simon: fairness, equity, balance. I know it sounds good, but no one really defines what that means. So Simon, from a demographic perspective, what does intergenerational fairness actually mean? How do we measure it? Is it even possible to compare generations who've lived through, as you've already started to say, such different economic and social environments?
Well, so it is very, very hard to compare your circumstance at age 40 today with a 40-year-old 1985, 40 years ago, because they lived through, this is a very different set of circumstances. You now have dual income households. You didn't have then. You have much higher house price to income ratios. You have longer life expectancies now, though. And you have a more educated education now than you did have in the past. So what do you want? What's in there? And the idea is not to fall into the trap of some sort of either envy arguments where we say, well, you had it so easy because you had access to housing faster. Well, it is, you had that, but in a sense, you also had lower life expectancy and so forth. So that is not a positive argument there. So I'd say we first and foremost need to be careful in this. And then you go, well, of course, as a government, my goal is to be ultimately fair to my population. So that I grant the government that this is the ambition of a policy set, is to go, I want to be fair to old people, to young people alike, if that makes sense. And then people come to measurements and go, well, how do we actually measure this? And then
Yes.
these measurements can be criticized or not. And so maybe we can dive into the hard numbers in a little bit to figure out how this plays out.
Well, one of the studies that's been quoted when you talk about numbers justifying this, let's call it a lens, came out of the ANU. It suggested that retirees' average post-tax income is about 75, 80% of what a mid-careers worker's income is. Now, that sounds high, but when you look closer, when you dig deep, those numbers include things like health care benefits. They only kick in if you're sick or you fail. So I guess maybe they're not really measuring privileges. How do you interpret these sort of statistics? Do they really prove that older Australians are better off, or are we measuring the wrong things?
Yeah, so of course I'm a data guy, and I go, if I want to explore these kind of things, I would look for data that I can use to make an argument, because I want to anchor my opinion in a data set. But so that's very hard, because if you wanted to introduce something like a well-being um, measurement, how do you do that? That is more or less how people remember or feel or argue about a thing. So that is very, very difficult. So then you can say, okay, so in general terms, an older Australian, we take the person in the 70s or 80s, they receive more services than younger people. Fair enough. That's the way it's meant to be. But how do we factor this in, and how do we then allow for the idea that you are now healthier at age 75 than you were 40 years ago at age 75? And that's difficult to figure this out. And so you'd say, of course, maybe a 40-year-old today is much worse off on the housing market compared to a 40-year-old 40 years ago, but they have better health and life expectancy that we grant them through historical movements. But the risk here is that we enter what I would call the suffering Olympics, where each generation just argues to the other generation that their worries, their concerns, their pains are bigger than the pains of the other generation. I say nobody is being helped by this. It's great clickbait. It's great political talking points if you talk to the right chord, and you spin the suffering Olympics in the right way. That works well, but I find that very hard. So I actually do enjoy a bit of data sets that were published in a piece that we read before, prepping for this podcast, where they compare the incomes of a 40-year-old today and I think 3 decades ago. And so you see how this shifts. So you see that the income gap between retirees and somebody in their prime working age at 40 is now much smaller. So now a worker earns 17% more money than a retiree, than an 80-year-old, or has access to income. Of back in the day, in the early 90s, a worker had 55% more income available to them than a retiree. So they say, well, okay, so retirees became older. Then, of course, you could argue, well, you don't need to envy the old people for that wealth because they earned it. Of course, you should accrue more assets that can pay off, that can create a wage for you as well, or an income for you as well, because you had more time to accrue that. And you go, okay, I get that argument, but that argument is also a bit short-sighted, because you'd say, well, how much tax benefits should we give to someone? That's what the government can do. It can tax or not tax certain things. And so you'd go, well, who should we favor when? And that's the balancing act for government.
Well, I think baby boomers and the retirees worked through their years paying taxes, assuming the government would give them a pension, it's not much nowadays, and also give them health benefits and free medical services. So I guess that was part of the deal they were brought up with. Obviously, the world has changed considerably since then, Simon. But I think there is an element of envy, as you said, especially about property, resentment, rife when you look at it on social media. Older Australians, they bought their homes. Yes, they were cheaper. Yes, it was maybe a little bit easier. But if you actually go back, if you took one of today's 40-year-olds and they lived in the late 80s or early 90s, we had 18% mortgage rates. Okay, that was only for a short time, but we were really happy when your home mortgage was less than 10%. We had much higher unemployment. We had high inflation, so the cost of everything kept ramping up. I wonder whether if you took them back 40 years, they'd still think that they had the short end of the stick today.
Yes, and so that's the argument that I always make when you play this historical game. On what time of history would you want to live? The only answer always is the present. Because the world on average has gotten better. So if somebody tells me they want to live in the Middle Ages, I'm just fainting. This makes no sense. You always want to live with the best medical services around. You want to live in times when a social safety net is there, and you want to live in times of peace. That is an absolute a given. And it's of course fun to say, yes, I want to live in the 80s or the 70s. But usually people say this because this is when they're youths, when their their carefree youth took place. You're not reminiscing about the wonderful 70s. You're reminiscing about a time when you had no responsibilities, when you could just get up whenever you wanted and you just live this carefree life. That's what you're really reminiscing about. But so that's it. So I do have personal problems with this generational envy narrative, but we still, if you find a hard data point to look at and you go for something like access to housing, we do have good measures that we can compare. Income to house price ratios. And of course, the interest rates do play an important role, but it is also true that when interest rates are high, the income to house price ratio is low, that the high interest rates actually make it very easy to save up for the down payment. So you get into the property market relatively quickly. And then as long as you can keep up with your mortgage repayments, you can actually pay off this house relatively quickly because the income to house price ratio is so low. So that's still there. Yeah? And we're not, as a young generation, when we would be saying, you had it easier then, we're not saying it was easy. We're not saying there were no sacrifices or anything like this. Yeah? And we do, of course, have these bizarre shifts in realities where back in the 70s or 80s, who was able to afford overseas holidays every year?
Yes.
That is such an important thing for the lives of the young people who can afford basic, sexy technology left, right, and center. So these are things that now the young generations have access to at low cost, that is very desirable to have those things. But of course, you compare yourself to a basic thing, usually with your parents' generation, where you go, I'm 30, I'm renting, I'm sitting in some sort of shared apartment somewhere. Yes, I can go on holiday every year, but the idea of owning a property, and my parents at 30, they had a property and 3 kids, and I'm sitting here, nothing, not even a pet. And so you go, what's that? And so then you choose to look at this particular instance of your life where you feel shortchanged. And then, of course, the older generation does the same thing, but they look at a different aspect. You go like, mate, I couldn't have dreamt of affording a car and a holiday or something like this. But it's just, that's the way things shifted.
They have, but it does seem that the divide between those who own assets, and in particular property, and those who don't, has only become wider, Simon.
Yes, and that's because we continue to drive asset prices up and up and up. And there was this moment somewhere in the 90s where we really shifted the way that we used housing from a shelter to a financial asset. And if you bought before that, you really were swept along in a big style by the ever increasing property values, therefore. And so this game is getting tougher and tougher, especially now that we see wages not grow as fast as property growth. So therefore you feel very much shortchanged. And so now this is where the government comes in and goes, that is per se not a problem. Having a bigger cohort of people renting, I do not view as a problem as long as those people are working and creating more money. This becomes a problem the day that you retire and that you have less money coming in, because then the rent that you will still need to pay takes up a very, very big proportion of your income each month. And that then can lead much more likely to poverty in old age, which then translates into more government spending that we have on those people, which breaks the budget. So we don't want that to occur. So as a government, I would now very much focus on some sort of way to ensure that our young people at some point before they retire, I don't care when, will become property owners. That's very, very important for the system as a whole.
Well, when I said to you, let's have a chat today, the theme was really, is the Albanese government about to rob the elderly in the name of fairness with this intergenerational lens? But they're giving young first home buyers the ability to get into the property market with a 5% deposit, no income caps, and actually quite high caps on what they can borrow, 1.5 million in Sydney, 1 million in Brisbane, 950 in Melbourne. So they're not able to just get into the lower, but to medium priced properties. I don't hear any baby boomers complaining the other way around. Hey, why are you giving the young people this chance to get into the housing market?
Well, I think because these policies more or less benefit property owners, because
Of course they do.
any first home buyer grant, any 5% home loan guarantee drives prices up. It might make people enter the housing game, but it also drives prices up. And so you go, how long can this game continue? And of course, you create an ever larger number of people who have an interest in higher house prices. Everyone who owns a house, 3/4 of voters own a house or have a mortgage on it. Now, the banks, anyways, they do nothing but mortgages for all intents and purposes. The bigger and longer a mortgage is, the better that is. And now the mortgage, you get a mortgage on 5% down payments and the government guarantees it. That means the federal government actually wants house prices not to drop because they guarantee those loans. The state governments, they are obsessed with high property prices anyways because they earn way over 50% of their income through property taxes. So you have this whole system that wants higher house prices, and all the while the young people go, except for us, young and poor people. They say, well, except for us, we actually would appreciate if these things would go lower. And instead of creating a system where you drive down prices because you'd alienate too many powerful stakeholders, the 2.5 million mom and dad landlords in Australia, for example, and the banks and the two big parties actually too. So I go, well, let's rather find ways to push a couple of people through additional systems into the system so that they then become an owner of sorts of a small share of their property and therefore want prices to go up as well. And you go, how long can this go for? And that's when people argue that this is a bubble. That's their argument. And we can, of course, argue that this can continue for quite a while because you don't need to afford to be part of the property market. You don't need to afford the house. You need to be able to afford the down payment. And so if we take this from 20% now down to 5%, and we'll soon see people offering 40-year mortgages. The 50-year mortgage is now floated in the US as an idea by Trump. So you go, well, then you can enter the market. You just do it at a very low base.
Well, we've seen that on the ground with our offices at Metropole in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, where first home buyers are already taking advantage of these grants and they're out there at open for inspections, bidding at auctions. Now, interestingly, not all first home buyers are going to do it straight away in the first couple of months this is available. Some are on leases, some are still at home, some are with their parents, some are still saving a deposit. So I can see this underpinning property values for quite some time. In fact, recently, Totality have reported that Australia, total real estate market in Australia is now worth over $12 trillion. I remember when it was 9 trillion and not that many years ago. Now, yes, people are talking about a bubble, but there's only $2.4 trillion worth of debt against this. Now, I say only 2.4 trillion. That's a 21% loan to value ratio. As we've discussed often in this show, there's a lot of people who have no mortgage, probably half of those homeowners, and many have paid off a significant part of their mortgage. But Simon, the points you made a moment ago make me think in one of the future shows, I'd like to have a discussion with you about who are the winners and who are the losers when property values rise. That's a whole topic on its own. So if you're watching this or listening to this and you don't currently subscribe to this show, just click the subscribe or follow button, please, so that you get our regular shows once a week. Now, at Metropole, we help our clients take advantage of these property markets, not of people, but by starting off by putting a strategy together and then helping home buyers and investors safely outperform the markets by giving them strategic advice and then helping them implement the advice. Simon, we recently won an award, 3 awards from Finder for Australia's best, most trusted buyers agents and most respected buyers agents. There were 2 other little awards we won as well. We didn't even enter into that competition, but 60,000 people voted and Metropole came out on top. We're much more than buyers agents, but I was very proud of our team's results. If you're interested in taking advantage of a team that's having them on your side to protect you in the market, go to metropole.com.au. Leave a link in the show notes. Now, Simon, I got a few more questions I want to ask you, but beforehand, after my shameless plug for Metropole, tell us a little bit about the Demographics Group and how you help your clients.
So when we talk about the property market from a demographic perspective, we are not the biggest experts on the specific property regulations and finances, but we look at how the demographic lens and the desires of people, where they would want to live and so forth, and how many of them are around, and the generational values, how this impacts the property market. So we plonk our demographic expertise, our demographic perspective on top of whatever topic we are discussing, because it is the biggest, most predictable driver in forecasting is demographics. And so we have a body of expertise around this, and we tell people about this on stage, at presentation, at boardroom, strategic discussions, at consulting type projects, to anyone who's willing to listen.
Well, we'll leave a link in the show notes so people can get in contact with you, the Demographics Group. And only before we press the record, we were talking about Wealth Retreat. It's the last weekend of May in 2026 that you're coming again as a keynote speaker. So if people want to hear you, see you live and talk about Australia's future, go to wealthretreat.com.au and express your interests. But getting back to this question about, is the Albanese government going to rob the elderly in the name of fairness? Superannuation always comes up as well. There's this popular idea that super is lightly taxed at the moment, but is that actually true?
Okay, big topic, the super topic. So when I think about super, my first way of phrasing it is like, what is this meant to do? So why do we introduce superannuation? And in my humble reading of it, I'm a gigantic fan of superannuation. Not saying that it needn't some kind of reform, but ultimately what we've done in the early 90s, we understood that the big baby boomer cohort is going to retire. And if they all retire and they draw down on the pension system, that is an awful lot of pressure on the humble pension system. So how about we force everyone to save a bit of money for their retirement, and we give them their own bucket to put money in? That's the superannuation bucket. And we allow you tax breaks on that bucket to encourage you to save. And the explicit goal is that you have enough money in your bucket so that you pay for your own retirement and that you will never ever need to draw down on the pension system. That's my interpretation of why we have a super system.
Yes.
And I would compare this to places like Germany, like France, that do not have a superannuation system. These are countries where you have one big bucket and there's a formula. You put that much money in based on your wage during your working years, and then you get that much money out at the end. The problem is that those systems were never adjusted, and that in those countries you now must significantly increase pension age, that you must actually slow down pension payouts. So you limit the growth of pension payouts. You might even have to stagnate them or decrease them at some point. Political poison, these kind of things. You see in France, if they introduce even the most modest increase of a pension age, you have people on the streets burning cars. And we don't have that. So super is absolutely fantastic for that. The criticism now of the superannuation system is that some of those tax breaks are too generous. You go, okay, so I get it. You pay for your own pension system, so you get quite a bit of money into your super so that you never need to draw down on the pension system. But then you look at it and you see like there are super accounts with hundreds of millions of dollars in it. And we only tax this large amount. There are not many with such high balances, but they exist. And so you go, why do we give those accounts, and why do we tax this money at 17% or whatever it is, instead of taxing it at 50% at the top rate? So you go, we are somehow this doesn't match the litmus test of this is fair. And so that discussion about this extreme amount of wealth stored in some super funds trickles down to super as a whole. And you go, well, you need to be very careful in how you lead this discussion, because ultimately you want to have your super balance big. If you're 40 now, you want that your super balance is absolutely juicy when you are old.
Yes.
And of course, we always need to talk about indexing any kind of super cap. If you want to introduce something like this on paper, if you don't introduce it, it's absolutely madness to me. It's like our income tax rates not being linked to inflation is also madness, but it's again by design. So I think that's where lots of this sense of unfairness from younger people come from. We're really giving tax benefits to the super rich. Whereas I'm saying if you have $1 million in super, I don't care. That's fine. Call it 2 million, call it 3 million, index it for inflation, whatever. But I think just politically speaking, it would be very, very important to introduce some sort of cap on super, of course, indexed, just to provide a sense of equity, equality, fairness. I think that's important. And so with any kind of reform, there is a mathematical element in there, but there's also I'd call it a gesture in there that shows you there is something. So I, for example, would say if I increase my migration intake, I would need to show in some sort of way that I'm taking care of the perceived risks. So I would say if you are a criminal and you have some sort of severe thing, then we kick you out. Something like this. So you introduce this, but you also introduce the countermeasure. Even if it's more of a gesture that will impact a small number of people, it is important to get the sense of balance and fairness right.
Well, superannuation is compulsory. Employers have to put money into it, but some people earn higher wages. But there's also the ability to contribute extra to fund your future retirement. I guess one of my concerns, Simon, is if younger Australians lose faith in the idea of self-funded retirement, it could create a generation more dependent on government support.
And the super system, we talk about this with the baby boomers in mind at the moment, because we are pretending that the millennial generation isn't going to retire. The millennials are much bigger than the baby boomers. This super system must be working and must ensure that very, very few people draw down on the pension system once the millennials move into retirement. And of course, the oldest millennial is 44, something like this. So that is still out a couple of decades. But of course, if these millennials then have a lower home ownership rate and not enough super, things can be critical. There'll be too many people who will need help and support, who either we let be poor or who drive down more on the or draw down more on the system. That's not good. So it's important to get this right rather quickly. Yes, the boomers are important to sort this out for them. But when I look at those forecasts for millennials retiring, it gets much more severe.
Simon, I guess one of the things that bothers me about this intergenerational fairness agenda is that it's a distraction. The government needs more money. Should it be focusing more on, I don't know, productivity, housing supply, innovation, tax reform, not trying to shift money between age groups like a political shell game?
That always helps. It is, of course, a bit weird to start from a political perspective, to start any kind of generation against generation kind of warfare narrative, because these are all your voters. So you're not actually winning votes in this process. I think this is ultimately hurting you, and you're well and truly right. So the idea is, as a country, you constantly need to be obsessed about boring terms like productivities. Jim Chalmers is quite right in his general argument that we must increase productivity, and that any kind of innovation that increases productivity, we talk about AI, robotics, and so forth, that these things are our friends. Absolutely. But we also, just if you look at the government, it needs to make money, it needs to create tax so that it can pay for stuff. And people always feel that tax is a net negative for them, because you get some sort of, it says like, here, you earned $100,000. And you go like, yes, I have $100,000. Turns out, no, quite a big chunk of this actually stays with the government. So you feel like, man, I've just been robbed of $30-something thousand. You've not been robbed. This is very much part of the system. But you go, well, it's only the wage, maybe. And so then people think about tax reform where income tax isn't as important, where maybe you tax wealth. And that is something, if you see that the young people don't feel that their wage provides them with a decent life, they will get peeved. And we see this when you talk to employers, big employers, they say that a pay rise isn't as juicy of a carrot anymore as it once was, because young people go, okay, I could work my butt off. And back in the day it worked. You said $5,000 more and you worked your butt off to get those $5,000 more a year. Now these $5,000 are $10,000 because inflation, but people don't react to this wealth carrot anymore because they go, yeah, I can afford the basics of life right now, but the idea of owning a home that is so far out of sight, the $10,000 won't make a difference. So therefore, that's where the quiet quitting movement comes from in a whole generation, where you say, I do the bare minimum so that I don't get fired. I collect my paycheck and I try to create meaning, purpose in my life outside of that. Maybe I run a side gig to increase my wage or something like this. And that is poison for productivity. So you go, well, how can we change that? And the tax incentive would be to say, you get to keep much more of your wage so that the money carries you further. But then you need to tax something else, which would be a tax on wealth or consumption in some way or form, or death tax maybe, which is a wealth tax. And so you go, how politically likely is that? And so I view both major parties as politically timid. So I'm not expecting anything brave or controversial to come out of it. The coalition will try to score points with net zero in emissions terms and a bit of migration cuts. They'll be the craziest things that they will put forward. They will not touch a major tax reform or anything like this.
I think I agree with you. Look, summing it all up, every generation, as far as I can see, has built on the sacrifices of the last. My parents didn't blame their parents, and I don't see why we should start now. Punishing the elderly, in my mind, isn't fairness, it's folly. So, Simon, if you were advising government, what are some genuine intergenerational fairness policies that you'd suggest, or would you be suggesting different paths to help fill the government coffers?
So first and foremost, you need to move away from the political theater of it all and go, don't use this to score points and don't personalize it. So the idea is to not say, so as a general human gesture, whenever you talk to people, you want to value them and you want to understand that they are a real person, that they live their own real life challenges and so forth. So then you'd go on to a much more ruthless, if you will, kind of like data-driven arguments. They say, what can we actually do to drive productivity? How can we, I would always call it the weaponization of the migration system. How can we utilize migrants better, more efficiently? How can we have a geographic element, a better job matching element in the migration scheme that is driving up productivity? And so that makes sense. You could then, of course, also argue, well, if you want to become more productive, you should channel more money into the stock market because that allows businesses to become more productive. At the moment, we of course put all our money in the housing market because it creates much better returns and it's leveraged and so forth. It's great stuff. And so you go, well, should we touch that? But then you go, well, I'm alienating the largest cohort of my voters. So just doubling down on productivity would be easy. That, of course, would introduce the need to have energy costs. Because any kind of productivity gain would mean a diversification of the economy, which would mean we need to have more footloose industries, which means data centers, which is energy intensive, which means value-added manufacturing to mining and agriculture, which means energy. So you should definitely try the best you can to cut energy costs in half. I'm just half. It's not a scientific measure. It's just a nice polemic thing of saying it needs to be heaps cheaper. That should be an absolute policy win. You're not alienating anyone with it. So that should be a big fat focus. Yeah. And of course, ultimately, you want to make sure that, in a sense, I get the idea of creating equity around generations, because ultimately you want to make sure that everybody gets a fair go. It goes back to that simple truism in Australia, wanting to give everybody their fair go. But to do this across generations, across so many different circumstances is outrageously hard. But you must ensure that the young people in the country feel that the system that they live in delivers wealth and prosperity to them. If they don't feel that, they will vote for stuff outside of the system. The system means we go away from boring stuff like democracy and capitalism. And that is, historically speaking, has been proven to be a nightmare. So it'd be rather good if you ensure right now that the young people feel positive about the system that they're living in.
That's a really good way of finishing this off. So I guess what I'm hearing from you, Simon, is real fairness doesn't come from robbing Peter to pay Paul. It comes from growing the pie so everyone gets a bigger slice, no matter when they were born. So let's be blunt, intergenerational equity sounds good, but it's rarely defined. We haven't really understood it properly, and it's not really grounded in data. Older Australians aren't necessarily better off because they've exploited the system. They built the foundations that younger generations are now standing on. So let's give the younger generations the opportunity to enjoy this great country as well. And Australia's prosperity really depends on cooperation between the generations, Simon, in my mind, not on envy between them.
Oh, and envy is not a policy. Envy is just it's just this weird emotional thing that you throw out. It's what I call the suffering Olympics, is the idea to show, because ultimately you want to be seen and heard and valued. That's the human emotion deep in us. And so if we say, you boomers had it easy, or you young folks don't know what it is like to suffer, and there's so much social advances that took place over the last 40 years that you can just like snatch up for free, all that is true in a sense, and all that is also nonsensical in a sense, because ultimately make sure that you create basic prosperity for as many people as possible. And I'd say then in Australia, from a tax reform perspective, the biggest thing is taxing our mining wealth more. That is the easiest way to create more wealth that then can be spread across the population. So getting those settings right, that is probably much more important than small fry stuff that you can win with taxing, inheritance.
Retirees, basically, older people. Sure. Look, thank you very much. I always enjoy our weekly chats. And if you've been watching or listening to this and you've enjoyed it as well, and you want to understand the demographic trends that are going to shape your future, whether it's in your life, in your occupation, in business, or in property, subscribe to Demographics Decoded. Just click the subscribe or follow button wherever you're listening to us now. And please do Simon and me a favor. The only favor we ask of you, tell somebody about our show as well. The audience keeps growing, and we want to help as many people in Australia take advantage of living in this great country. Thanks, Simon. Look forward to catching up with you again next week.
I'll see you soon next week.
This Demographics Decoded podcast has been brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Just go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property advisory, wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team at Metropole will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades, and we've been helping clients with for well over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. In between these Demographics Decoded shows, you can follow me on social media, and I suggest you also follow Simon Kuestenmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all social media platforms. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody who may also benefit, please tell them about Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to be shaping their future. And of course, if you don't currently subscribe, we'd love you to. And of course, any of the information that we've been sharing with you is general information because we don't know your specific circumstances.